They're saying at best they could get, in ideal conditions, 50% cleaned up. If there's one thing about this part of the world, it's that ideal conditions are pretty few and far between. The pipeline itself crosses a lot of very important rivers for people's drinking water, for communities, for the salmon stocks, which are so important to this region, all the way as it goes back to northern Alberta, where we already know the impacts that it's having on the Athabasca River, which has become one of the most polluted waterways in the world, and the human health impacts that's having on First Nations communities downstream.
Alberta tar sands, the biggest industrial project in the world, where the size of Earth that they want to move is the size of Texas. Kinder Morgan make $13 million a day. And not only do they make that much, but they're subsidized by our Canadian government. We immobilized the community, 100% consensus by Tsleil-Waututh Nation, where we had a referendum and they said, we could negotiate for millions of dollars with Kinder Morgan. That could help some of our people out of poverty. Or we could use our own little resources that we have and fight them. 100% consensus, we chose to fight them.
So right here is home. We haven't left. This is where we've been for thousands of years. 85% of our diet came from the waters behind us. We've been measuring the quality of water here for about 20 years. It's getting progressively worse. We're devastated, and what we're trying to do is rehabilitate the damage that has caused. We're going to court soon, Canada, for not consulting us on Kinder Morgan expansion. One of the ministers said, why don't the First Nations take the money? They need it. We don't need it more than our land. We'll do whatever it takes to make sure this doesn't happen in any way possible.
We are going to launch a massive flotilla of boats from here and surround the terminal on the other side where tankers fill up, as well as have a group of folks on land march to the gates of the marine terminal so that we block it from both the land and the water. It is in a lot of ways a battle between a story of the old and a story of the new. There's a lot of powerful forces trying to make sure that the story of the old continues for as long as it can. We've seen disobedience move from being something that a few people do to a mass movement confronting the fossil fuel industry.
A massive oil rig outfitted for Royal Dutch Shell's remote Arctic exploration parked in Seattle's harbor on Thursday, but not everyone is happy about it.
They have convinced us progress is only made through exploitation of the earth. Everyone is coming to protest. We have scientists, ecologists, and city council members who are willing to get arrested because they understand the severity of this moment. Stand up in whatever manner you can. This is our lunch counter to sit on. This is our history to be made. We hold the world in our hands. Thank you.
Civil disobedience is a powerful tool in social justice work. The law, it's not sacred, and to challenge it shakes our consciousness. If you can take that radical action in a way that genuinely speaks to everybody else, then you not only have their attention, you have their inspiration, and you build movements that way. Number one, preparation. Calibrate what you are asking for and how you ask for it so that you can win it. Then you've got to choose your strategy. You've got to choose a tactic, a target that can successfully grab public attention. Then you've got to make sure that your execution is flawless. The media will look for every opportunity to delegitimize you. If there is one misstep, one act of violence, it's over.
I've never been in the White House, But the ability to chain myself to the outside of the White House turned out to be important and empowering, and anyone can do it. Most of us don't have huge sums of money. All of us have a body that we can put in the way. I want to say very clearly that civil disobedience is but one tool in the activist toolbox. It's not the first one that you should reach for, and if you use it all the time, like any other tool, it's going to get dull. That said, civil disobedience has a role to play. Nobody should have to go to jail about climate change. In a rational system, that would be the last thing that would happen. But because the way power is distributed in our world, sometimes we have to.
One of the central threats to democracy today is the corporate capture of government. We are up against tremendous resources, and those resources are smart. The corporation goes straight to the politician that's going to be on the committee, that's going to pass the law that they want to pass, and threatens their re-election at exactly the right time. The strategy of global corporations on climate change was partly to recognize that they had a trump card with the United States government. They could stand in the way of global action by blocking American action. There's a level of state failure in the United States. The legislature is bought and paid for by oil companies and other companies. We have to roll back corporate capture of our governments if we want to try and fix these problems that conflict directly with their industry bottom line.
There's nothing radical about anything we're talking about. Radicals work at oil companies. If you are willing to get up in the morning and make your fortune by altering the chemical composition of the atmosphere, and you're willing to do it once scientists have told you what would happen, and once you've seen it happen, once you've watched the Arctic start to melt, if you're willing to do that, then you're a radical, and our job is to try and check that radicalism.
An investigation is underway into ExxonMobil, the huge oil company, buried research about the effects of climate change.
Reports suggest more than 30 years ago, Exxon's own scientists were taking climate change projections into account in its operational plans.
Exxon was on the cutting edge of science. They wanted to be on the cutting edge of science 40 years ago on climate change. They understood that farther down the road, if the science was accurate, there would be limits placed on emissions from fossil fuels. So their strategy at that time was that we want to have a say in what those limits look like.
When their senior scientists told their senior executives what was coming, Exxon started making sure that all its drilling rigs were climate-proof so that they could withstand the rising sea level. But they did not tell the rest of us. Just the opposite.
Around 1989, there was a shift in the thinking at the executive level. And that was when Exxon joined this group called the Global Climate Coalition, which sounds very green. But in fact, they were put together to fight any policy reaction to climate change.
Exxon and others ended up hiring the veterans of the tobacco industry to try and make the same basic argument that the cigarette guys had made.
After 3 decades of investigation, no causal link between smoking and disease has been established.
Scientific evidence remains inconclusive as to whether human activities affect the global climate.
It was effective, and it cost us a generation's worth of time.
We just recently crossed 400 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. We're literally releasing all of that CO2 that got buried underneath Earth's surface over 100 million years. And we're releasing it over a time frame of 100 years, 1 million times faster than nature buried it. That is without precedent. It's unclear that living things, including human beings, can adapt to changes that occur that quickly.
In the Philippines, at least 6,000 farmers were blocking a highway to demand the government provide rice.
The farmers are starving. Behind all this is a rise in global temperatures, causing the whole region to suffer the worst drought in more than 20 years.
We've begun to see serious stress on the global food systems. We simply won't be able to grow enough food to feed 10 billion people in a warming world.
There's a study that looks at temperatures to come in much of the Middle East. And what they found was the combination of heat and humidity for stretches of time by 2100 would not be compatible with human life.
A new study published yesterday finds climate change exacerbated the worst drought ever in modern Syria, aggravating social unrest in the country and helping to push it over the brink into civil war.
A record 1 million refugees and migrants have now crossed into Europe in Europe's worst refugee crisis since the Second World War.
In other words, the very real security threat posed by climate change is only going to get worse.
You've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Social movements are different from ordinary politics in that they are not simply about how to divide up the goods, but about what a good is. It enters a domain that goes beyond immediate self-interest into what's required of us as responsible human beings.
The secret of civil disobedience is moral clarity. Gandhi said, "I am a human being first, and a citizen of my country second." He targets the fact that Indians aren't allowed to make their own salt, and has a massive salt march across India to the coast where he bends down and picks up sea salt. How could someone possibly prevent you from doing something like that? He's taken the weakest point of his opponent and targeted it to generate the most moral clarity.
Different forms of civil disobedience shaped the basis of the abolition movement, the women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement.
It's time for us to say, if you don't do something about it, we will have no alternative but to engage in broader and more drastic forms of civil disobedience in order to bring the attention of the nation to this whole issue in Selma, Alabama.
At the core of activism is one simple thing, and that's voice. So many people in the world, their voice is actually just not heard. The civil rights movement had a grounded belief that the first and most important thing to do was allow the people who were on the ground to be able to shape the direction and to be the front of what was happening. It was about building the capacity to organize for action and mobilizing the public to show up in support of an action.
The effect of civil disobedience is often to raise the cost of business as usual, to disrupt normal processes and procedures, which makes it more costly to resist change than to agree to it.
The African people are realizing that apartheid means nothing else but oppression and exploitation.
To change these conditions, the leading black liberation organization, the African National Congress, had begun a mass movement of civil disobedience, defying the laws of racial superiority called apartheid.
Civil disobedience brings a spotlight to the violence of oppressive states and industries. The civil disobedience that occurred in South Africa during the apartheid years defied all apartheid laws. And it was really, really strong because it happened everywhere. From street committees to unions, to labor movements, to student movements, everybody found an aspect of apartheid laws that affected them and then used some kind of mechanism to defy it. It didn't change overnight, and it wasn't one day of civil disobedience. It takes time, and you will have obstacles, but I really don't think there's any fight that we cannot win if we have the numbers.
Biz bu kirliliğe karşı burada Ali Ağa bölgesinde, yani sanayi bölgesi adı altında yapılan bu fütursuz sanayileşmeye karşı yıllardır bir mücadele içindeyiz.
Kapitalizmin hakim olduğu bir süreci yaşadık. Genelde onu yaşıyoruz. Şimdi özel şirketler etütleri yapıyorlar kendileri aralarında. Biz karşı çıkmaya çalışsak da, karşı çıksak da ikinci bir çevre hareketiyle kendileri çevre etütü yaparak bu sayfaları
tesisler yeni yapılırken, daha yeni işletmeye girerken, büyürken falan oraya işçi alınacağını, oradan para kazanılacağını çok kandırıldılar.
Her zaman var mı?
Bunu
bu her zaman için geçerli.
Anladık.
Yılda yapılacak daha sigara. 1989'un Mart'ında arkadaşlarımla birlikte belediye başkanı seçildikten sonra Ankara'dan bir Çevre Genel Müdürlüğü'nden bir bayan telefon etti. Dedi ki, tanışmıyoruz ama önemli olduğu için size Ali Ağa için bir kara haber vereceğim. Ali Ağa'da ithal kömüre dayalı 1000 megawatt gücünde bir termik santral kurulacak. Şili'den Kınağa kadar bütün belediye başkanlarını çağırdık. Türkiye'de vahşi kapitalizmin bir göstergesi olarak Ali Ağa'da başlayacak olan bir saldırı.
Termik santral kurulmaz. Halkımız istemiyor çünkü.
Termik santral alanına ağaçlarımızı, çocuklarımızla, evrim coşkunlarla, yavrularımızla dikeceğiz. Gücünüz yetiyorsa gelin sığdırın.
Kulakları çınlasın, İzmir Büyükşehir Belediye Başkanı'ydı o zaman. Yüksel Çakbu ve bizim 18 belediyemiz yine bir sevgi zinciriyle protesto ettik. Aşağı yukarı 60 kilometrelik bir alanda 50 bin kişinin katıldığı bir çevre hareketi. Bunu o gün yaptığımızda belki de Türkiye'de şimdiye kadar yapılmış olan çevre hareketlerinin içerisinde en çok ilgi gören eylem oldu.
Bu sanayi, burada bizim verdiğimiz mücadele orada sadece bir termik santralı durdurabildik. Ama geniş bir alandaki sanayinin devam etmesine engelleyemedik. Bugün Ali Ağa'da bile bir yeni termik santral kurulur vaziyette kurulmaya devam ediyor. Kimse ses çıkarmıyor. Oradaki insanlar adeta bizi kovalayacaklardır. Yani bizim geçim kaynağımızı yok ediyorsunuz. Bunu açıkça söylüyorlar dediler. Benim burada kanser oluyorsunuz, ölüyorsunuz dedik. Ne olacak dedi ama işimiz yok dedi. Aç bu işimiz.
Yani biraz insanları açlıkla terbiye etme gibi bir şey değil mi? Ya.
Ben onları iki belediye otobüsüne bindirdim, yatağına götürdüm. Yatağında nasıl etkilendiklerini anlatan bir köye var. Hatta birinin burnu tavşan burnu gibiydi. Birisinin kulağı yarımdı falan. Onlar anlattılar. Yatağın termik santralinden kaynaklanan doğum, sakat doğum oldu. Dönüşte tüm horoz yediği şeydi, eylemdi.
Bir eylem planımız var. Bu eylem planımıza da Türkiye'deki fosil yakıtı karşıtı bütün yaşam savunucuları, uluslararası fosil yakıt karşıtı yaşam savunucularını buraya davet ediyoruz. Hep birlikte el ele bu fosil yakıtlardan kaynaklı kötü gidişe bir son vermek istiyoruz.
biz bu 90 ruhunu tekrardan yaşatacağız.
You cannot pretend that we do not exist. You cannot plead ignorance to our problems because we are here.
What power means in the context of social change is, of course, the story of David and Goliath. The Philistines send their powerful warrior Goliath to go confront the Israelites, who are afraid. Until finally David, who is not a warrior but a shepherd, went to King Saul and says, "Let me go fight Goliath." The king says, "You're not equipped. You got to take my sword, my shield, my helmet." They're so heavy he can't move. And he reflects for a moment and says, "Wait a second. I'm a shepherd, not a warrior." He takes off all that armor, picks up a few stones, goes to face Goliath. It's only when he discovers his own resources, not those of his opponent, as the foundation of his strategy, that things begin to shift. And that's what creates those moments of opportunity for the Davids of this world.
Lignite has a very low energy density. That means you have to dig up a lot of it to get not that much energy. And in burning it, you emit a whole bunch of other dirt, essentially, which is why this is not just bad for the climate, it's also terrible for people's health. Germany produces and burns more lignite than any other country in the world in absolute terms, including India and China. We look at this now and we see the dirtiest of all the fossil fuels being dug up. And of course, it is the central driver of climate change, which is a central driver of conflict, hunger, destitution, deprivation around the world. This stuff has to be left in the ground. This little town called Proschim produces 100% of its own electricity from renewables and still exports stuff into the grid. Like, this village is actually the future we need. Here you have agriculture, biogas, solar power, you have a functioning community, and this is the front line in the struggle against the madness of profit-driven extraction. The government has slated Proschim for destruction because there's coal underneath this. What we're seeing here is the future being eaten by the past. Fossil fuels are the past in more than one way. They are the past of capital, they are the past of energy, they are the past of our relationship to nature. And Hallo, genau, wir können auch von Ihrem Land runtergehen, wenn Sie das stört. Okay, so this was Frau Rösch, who was just asking what we're doing on her land, and I started explaining, blah, blah, we're doing this film. She's like, "Are you against lignite?" Yeah. It's like, okay, then you can walk wherever you want. Folks lived here a few years ago. This was their lives. The government said, you can't be here because we're going to dig this up because there's coal underneath. They had grown up here. They were planning to maybe die here. These kinds of images, that's also why we're doing this. There's folks here being evicted from their homes because we cannot stop destroying the environment. This cannot go on.
In our lifetime, human beings left behind the Holocene, this 10,000-year period of benign climatic stability that coincides with the rise of human civilization. We have crossed a great threshold, and we stand on the edge of others.
I remember when the Weather Channel was this kind of like nice, sleepy little station. Now it's like a horror show. The climate is being disrupted. That's not for next year or 1,000 years from now. That's happening right now.
What all climate scientists will agree on is that the entire atmosphere has changed. All the atmospheric dynamics have changed. So every event that happens now is in the context of climate change, is different from how it would have been.
slammed the Philippines with winds of 195 miles per hour. That's higher than the winds from Hurricane Sandy and Katrina combined.
The world is mobilizing to help the Philippines, but just a trickle of food and water and medicine has reached the victims of Typhoon Haiyan.
More than 1 million people were forced to flee their homes, many now trying to salvage what's left.
Hundreds of thousands are thronging relief centers, desperate for life's necessities.
Many residents covered their faces to mask the smell of the dead while they searched for relatives in some of the hardest hit areas.
This is one of the top storms ever seen on this planet.
Mr. President, Your Excellency, what my country is going through as a result of this extreme climate event is madness. Super Typhoon Haiyan made landfall in my own family's hometown. And the devastation is staggering. I struggle to find words to describe how I feel about the losses. To anyone outside who continues to deny and ignore the reality that is climate change, I dare them to get off their ivory towers and away from the comfort of their armchairs. I dare them to go to the islands of the Pacific. We refuse as a nation to accept a future where super typhoons like Haiyan become a way of life. We refuse to accept that running away from storms, evacuating our families, counting our dead become a way of life. We simply refuse to. We can fix this. We can stop this madness.
Hello, hello, hello. All right, folks, we know why we're here. We have 80 days starting tomorrow to pull off the largest climate march in history. It's really important for folks to remember that although climate change affects everyone, the impacts are not evenly distributed. And we're asking each one of these breakout groups, prioritize people of color, folks, because this is real, it's disproportionate, and it's time to bring it.
They need to act on a binding global agreement to reduce greenhouse gases. We can do that and create jobs at the same time.
Part of what we're doing is moving people from fossil fuels to the solutions and also presenting them with economic opportunities around the solution.
The idea of who's going to be leading this march are the people in this room.
This environmental issue is the singular issue of our time, of our day, that will determine how we live, where we live, and if we live.
The most important tool that we have is our people power. There are already 325 groups, and that list is going to grow every single day. Whatever you're thinking about doing to help build this mobilization, rethink it and make it bigger, make it bolder. Our job is to make sure everybody hears about it, and then they'll get there. They'll get there. That's our job. In 1982, the UN convened a first special session on nuclear disarmament. And we came together and said, when the representatives of governments all around the world gather in New York City at the UN, we need to be on the streets making our voice heard.
New York City's anti-nuclear demonstration turned out to be the biggest political demonstration in U.S. history.
It was, and still to this date, is the largest single gathering, if you will, of people in this country. I think there was one computer in the office. Everything else was by phone and this thing we called the mail. We now call it a snail mail, whatever. But there was something about that reality that we didn't have the technology that we now have that actually forced people to talk directly to each other.
We have real peace with real justice. We will not go home and be quiet. We will go home and organize.
One of the really interesting things about that demonstration is that some 600 local groups were formed, and many of those groups lasted for years afterwards. To me, the real power of that day was the organizing experience that led up to it, and then the organizing that came out of it.
Some experts are saying now that the whole world is heating up because of a global greenhouse effect.
Scientists had been saying for a long time that climate change might occur, but 1988 is the year when Jim Hansen and his team at NASA say, both in the scientific peer-reviewed literature and in public, that it's actually happening.
The changes in atmospheric composition that humans were making was going to have a big impact on the Earth's climate. The greenhouse effect has been detected, and it is changing our climate now.
Hansen's testimony was reported on the front page of the New York Times, and there was actually a bill introduced into Congress, the National Energy Policy Act, to immediately begin to phase out the use of fossil fuels in order to prevent disruptive climate change. And of course, that was supported by the creation of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that year. So there was political momentum, there was scientific momentum, there was strong scientific evidence, there was media attention, and then the whole thing kind of fell apart.
The Earth Summit, a 12-day, 178-nation conference on the environment, began today in Rio de Janeiro. Battle lines are already drawn between the haves and the have-nots.
So far, all the agreements are non-binding, requiring no specific action on the environment.
As time has gone on, the scientific warnings keep intensifying, and yet there has been no effective political response. All political efforts to get a handle on this issue have essentially failed.
I am the one that is burdened with finding the balance between sound environmental practice on the one hand and jobs for American families on the other.
The agreement hammered out in Kyoto, Japan, requires industrialized nations to make substantial cuts in greenhouse gas emissions.
The United States actually never ratified the Kyoto Protocol, which is one reason it didn't work.
President Bush ignited a storm of controversy when he decided to abandon the Kyoto Protocol, which sets caps on the emissions of greenhouse gases in developed nations.
For nearly 2 weeks, the U.S. delegation had blocked proposal after proposal, draft after draft, refusing to even discuss mandatory cuts in greenhouse emissions.
Now we switch to the big climate conference going on in Copenhagen.
Today, developing countries made themselves heard.
People are dying.
Led by Africa, 135 nations, including India and China, staged a 5-hour boycott, angry over what they say are insufficient carbon cuts proposed by the world's rich countries.
If Hollywood had been writing the story, you know, it all would have come right in the end, and all the nations would have pledged their best effort, and nothing like that happened. The thing was a fiasco, a failure.
The frustrations of the last 10 days explode on the streets of Copenhagen. Outside the Bella Center, where negotiators still haven't reached a climate agreement, 2,500 protesters try to storm the hall to make an impact.
Nothing happened because the fossil fuel industry was still strong enough to scare nations into avoiding the issue.
What happened in Copenhagen for a lot of people was this realization no leader was coming to save us.
We have to be strong enough to scare our national leaders into doing the right thing in New York City in September. If we can demonstrate that, then better things will happen in Paris than happened in Copenhagen.
These things are not separate moments in time. This is all part of one string, and what we're fighting towards in Paris is highly dependent on what happens in September. This is going to have to be the fight of our lives.
Welcome to this press conference to present the report of IPCC Working Group 3 on mitigation of climate change.
If we really want to bring about a limitation of temperature increase to no more than 2 degrees Celsius, there is then the need for an unprecedented level of international cooperation.
The way we've approached climate change is the scientific community builds the case, it synthesizes the evidence, it presents that evidence then to the policymakers. We've proven beyond a doubt that climate change is real, that the Earth's temperature is warming, that warming is predominantly caused by the burning of fossil fuels and other human activities, and that additional warming poses a significant threat. What the policymaking community did was they came up with a definition of what they called dangerous human interference.
In 2009, the nations of the world agreed on a target of 2 degrees centigrade or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit of maximum warming above the pre-industrial level. That would require emissions worldwide almost entirely stopping within a matter of decades.
A lot of people talk about 2 degrees being the safe level. Well, there is no safe level. 2 degrees is a round number that would be safer, but we'll still have substantial climate impacts.
1 degree is melting the Arctic and the Antarctic. We'd be crazy to find out what 2 degrees will do, but we're probably going to find out. Even if we do everything right at this point, that's about as good an outcome as we can hope for.
The other thing that the IPCC did was that they tied that 2 degrees Celsius, 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit threshold to the amount of fossil fuels that we can actually burn. And they came up with this red line in the sand, which was 1 trillion tons of carbon.
The problem is that we're already more than halfway there. We're approaching 600 million tons already, and at the rate things are going, we will have completely exhausted that carbon budget within 30 years.
The same leaders who say they want the temperature to go up no more than 2 degrees have put forward a series of proposals that when you add them up leads to the temperature rising 6 degrees. A point past which most sane scientists think civilization on the scale that we now know it will not be possible.
It's almost a kind of refusal to come to grips with reality. There's just this enormous gap between what countries say they want to do and what they're actually on track to do. People call this the emissions gap.
Much of this is about mathematics. You got to leave 80% of fossil fuel in the ground. Fossil fuel industry wants to burn all its reserves. If they do, then we get that 6 degrees.
Each day of inaction, each day of business as usual puts us closer and closer on this crash course.
We're 2 months out from this demo. Obviously, we all know in this room a tremendous amount of work is happening every day, getting the word out, organizing people, mobilizing people. At this point, every day counts. And every day when we miss an opportunity, it's gone.
Because it's not just a one-day march, it's our long-term ability to build a strong climate movement that we need to invest in. So being inclusive to us is really about multiple things, but recognizing that we live in a society where there's privilege, there are inequities. In order to address the climate crisis, we have to first address those inequities. That will allow us to then bring a movement strong enough to address the global ecological crisis.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom.
We all know that whales eat fish and krill, and some people, certain politicians in Japan for instance, have argued that killing whales is good for human beings, as it boosts the food available for us to eat. And so you would think. But as the great whales declined, so did the numbers of fish and krill. It seems counterintuitive. Surely their numbers would rise as their major predators disappeared. But it now turns out that whales not only eat these animals, they also keep them alive. In fact, they help to sustain the entire living system of the ocean. Whales feed at depth in waters that are often pitch dark, and then they return to the surface, to the photic zone, where there's enough light for photosynthesis to happen. There they release what biologists call fecal plumes, vast outpourings of poo, poonamis. These plumes are rich in iron and nitrogen, nutrients which are often very scarce in the surface waters. And these nutrients fertilize the plant plankton that lives in the only place where plants can survive, the photic zone. Fertilizing the surface waters isn't the only thing the whales do. By plunging up and down through the water column, they also keep kicking the plankton back up into the photic zone, giving it more time to reproduce before it sinks into the abyss. Even today, though whale populations have been greatly reduced, the vertical mixing of water caused by movements of animals up and down through the column of the oceans is astonishingly roughly the same as the amount of mixing caused by all the world's wind and waves and tides. More plant plankton means more animal plankton, on which the larger creatures then feed. In other words, more whales means more fish and krill. But the story doesn't end here, because plant plankton not only feeds the animals of the sea, it also absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. When eventually it sinks to the ocean floor, it takes this carbon out of circulation down to a place where it remains for thousands of years. The more whales there are, the more plankton there is. The more plankton there is, the more carbon is drawn out of the air. When whales were at their historical populations, before great numbers of them were killed, it seems that they might have been responsible for removing tens of millions of tons of carbon from the atmosphere every year. Whales change the climate. The return of the great whales, if they're allowed to recover, could be seen as a benign form of geoengineering. It could undo some of the damage we've done, both to the living systems of the sea and to the atmosphere.
Everything is changing.
The very idea of human being some sort of natural concept is really going to change.
Our bodies will be so high-tech, we won't be able to really distinguish between what's natural and what's artificial.
Inside our own heads is the most complex arrangement of matter in the known universe.
You might ask yourself, can we get to be superhumans?
The original Industrial Revolution was driven by the discovery that you could use steam engines to do all kinds of interesting things.
But that was followed by additional revolutions for electricity and computers and communications technology. We're now in the early stages of the fourth industrial revolution, which is bringing together digital, physical, and biological systems.
One of the features of this fourth industrial revolution is that it doesn't change what we are doing, but it changes us.
With the ability to visualize brain activity, for example, through a simple consumer-based EEG device, it gives us access to ourselves in ways that we've never before thought possible. It unlocks the black box that is the brain and enables us to really, truly be able to realize an identity that is aspirational.
There's now a scientific foundation for the effects of mindfulness on the brain, on the genome, on biological aging. And when the human mind does know itself, then you get the potential for a new renaissance that restructures itself in terms of our relationship to life, our relationship to the planet, our relationship to work.
We need a different economic model. And by that I don't mean capitalism versus communism. What I'm talking about is a shift in the system along the lines of the two big changes that happened in the 20th century, Keynesianism, with a much greater focus on health and education and the role of government working with business, and then a reaction against that in late century to neoliberalism, where the focus was on free markets, freedom of the individual, and getting governments out of the way. We need a shift to a new system that will allow us to meet the basic needs of every human on the planet, that will live within planetary means, that will be fairer, and that will be focused as its key goal, not on growth per se, but on maximizing human well-being. And history tells us that a values shift is triggered by creation of a new story about how we want to live.
I see the circular economy as something which fits very closely with mankind's goal to be innovative and creative and to always progress. We can use asset tracking, we can use IT, we can use 3D printing to enable this different economic model to recover materials, feed them back into the economy, and really to decouple growth from the resource constraints we have.
The reason we live in cities is not different today than it was 10,000 years ago. Even if we have got networks connecting us, we still want to have places where we meet in person. Well, this means the place where we work and the place where we live are much closer to each other, a city where we don't need to have big supply chains in order to produce things, where many things can be sourced locally thanks to 3D printing and robotics. So if we're able to do something to transform cities, to make them more efficient, then the impact can be huge.
Think about the prospect of getting rid of plastics. We must not only be inspired or informed by nature, but actually use natural organisms with which to design products and building parts. Only instead of varying material properties, we're varying biological functionality.
Design is critical today because it's the first signal of human intention. So the question of adding quality to quantity, it isn't a matter of simply circulating things that are potentially toxic. It's circulating things that are safe and healthy for all generations. So the goal is no longer, I want to be less bad, less monotonous, less unsafe, less unjust. It's really about a diverse, safe, healthy, and just world with clean air, clean water, clean soil, clean energy.
Together we are fighting to preserve our fragile climate from irreversible damage and devastation of unthinkable proportions.
If we think about the original Industrial Revolution, it was an energy revolution. I like to think of it as a kind of bookending of a period in human history during which we used fossil fuels, and it worked very well for us for a long time. But now we have to bring that to an end. We have energy technologies that can power our civilization: solar, wind, biomass. So then the question is, well, how do we get grid integration? Maybe the wind is blowing in Denmark, the sun is shining in Germany, and now you can move that electricity through an integrated grid. You can supply energy to everyone who needs it, and you can supply energy at all times.
Walking around, you do see different stuff as far as like the body marriage line. They use a lot of things that help them lift up and move things to the car. You just sit there and, you know, program something, and it has its own set mind to go ahead and do everything. And then as humans, we just come in and take the extra step to help the technology.
It's not the cure-all for everything. There's definitely a lot of things where people perform the operation better, but certainly for the right applications, robotics are a huge improvement for the process.
The prediction of 5 million jobs lost by 2020 to technology is serious, but it's not the main question. Construction, manufacturing, services, public health and education, these industries will still exist. The main question is, what will be the future of work? How will we define work? How will we share the wealth?
From the viewpoint of the labor or jobs, now we really need new education or new training.
We're working with A World in Motion in FIRST Robotics, trying to encourage students from 3rd grade all the way up through the end of high school. We had students make sailboats, and then we had them race them, and so they could see how quickly they could move. And they immediately went back and started to say, oh, I saw what happened, I'm going to go change this or that. And that was 3rd graders.
I just given a prize to a kid of 18 years old that has discovered something really very, very unique. Came up with how to get better productivity and better yields for seeds of corn. And so he basically came with the idea that if you would perforate these seeds, you would get more food. And you think about it and say, but he didn't go to university. So how does he get all that knowledge? And he told me, I've been watching YouTube since the age of 12, and I'm so interested that I've seen everything about it. I've read everything about it. The world is really open to learning. The thing is, how do you give the incentive to your kids to do that?
It's this ability of digital technology to change outcomes, to truly empower people all over the world that can create a more equitable growth, because I think the world needs that.
Fourth industrial revolution has the potential to make inequalities visible and to make them less acceptable in the future, and hopefully to gather and garner political support to take the necessary decision to reduce the gap.
Humans have always been using tools, but because of the recent advances in technology, we're beginning to have machines that can augment us in all sorts of interesting ways.
I was the first person in the world to be able to voluntarily move my legs while stepping in a robot by exciting the nervous system using electrical stimulators directly onto the spine. We believe that a cure will be possible if enough of the right people have the will to fast-track a cure for paralysis.
We take two things from the patient. First, we take a three-dimensional X-ray and we extract the three-dimensional data out of that so we can make a perfectly shaped puzzle piece. And then we also take a sample of fat tissue from the patient so that we can extract the stem cells out of those. And we use those stem cells with this three-dimensional scaffold that we fabricate, and after 3 weeks we have a piece of living bone that's ready for implantation.
Being able to use genome editing to understand the genetic changes that lead to cancer, and technologies like drug delivery, getting molecules into particular types of cells. There's a lot of excitement about being able to move much more quickly on this disease.
One of the things that I think is so essential to free and open societies is freedom of thought. And up until now, the conversation we've been having is around freedom of speech. Once we can access people's thoughts and access people's emotion, we have to create a space that enables people to think freely, to think divergent thoughts, to think creative thoughts. And in a society where people fear having those thoughts, the likelihood of being able to enjoy progress is significantly diminished.
We need to take responsibility at every level of society, from the individual and the personal to the institutional to the global, to adapt to these technological challenges and changes which are redefining what it means to be human, what it means to work, what it means to be completely embedded in this world.
People always ask me if I'm an optimist or a pessimist. The technology exists, but how do we get it and implement it at the scale we need at a price that people around the world can afford?
Even though we have everyday problems we have to solve, we have to find a way to lay the foundations for the innovations of tomorrow.
How do we understand our place in the universe? How do we try to answer the big questions in life? Who are we? What are we made of? Where do we come from? With the advent of digital age of computing, we were suddenly able to answer questions never before solved. Exploring the relationship between the imagination of the scientists and the frontier of computing and the ever closer reality of the universal quantum computer, this film examines the hazy boundary between imagination and reality.
So what I want to build is a large-scale quantum computer, a device which can solve certain problems so much faster, tremendously much faster. So what means much faster here? Much faster means that even the fastest classical computer may take 1 million years for a problem a quantum computer can solve in a few milliseconds. So that means we can solve problems which we never even thought of that would be solvable. You know, we may find new drugs, we may understand processes in biology, we may understand life itself. I grew up in Germany in a place called Ulm, close to Munich and Stuttgart. My mom would always say I'm asking a hole in her stomach because I kept on asking questions about everything. My father would take me to the planetarium and we would watch the shows, and I would go out in the evening with my telescope and try to learn about the planets and about nebulas and space in general. I watched Star Trek in primary school, and then I wanted to be science officer on the Enterprise. And then I did some research and tried to figure out what do I need to study to become science officer on the Enterprise. I realized that actually being on a spaceship is not so great, but understanding nature is actually pretty awesome. So and understanding how things work, the mysteries of quantum physics, in fact the mysteries of subatomic particles, of how the world works. What I really wanted to do is building something which can teleport somebody from A to B, building some kind of shield for a starship, building a starship engine or things like that. All these kind of things fascinated me. And so this is maybe the starting time of my scientific career, really. One of the things which is very strange is that you could be at two different places at the same time. So it doesn't mean there's two of you, it means you are at two different places at the same time. And so we actually make use of that, not with people, but with individual atoms. And so we have them at two places at the same time. There's another very strange thing, which is entanglement. And basically what that means is if you have two entangled particles, and you separate these two particles and put them on one end each of the universe. If you do something to one of these particles, then something will happen to the other particle, even though they don't communicate. And that's just very strange. It really is completely mind-boggling. And we actually trying to utilize such quantum effects to build a quantum computer. For a normal traditional computer, you write certain things into the memory, and then, for example, a number, and that number then goes through the processor, is computed, maybe multiplied with another number, and the output happens. Now imagine you could write all the numbers in the world simultaneously into your memory and compute simultaneously all the calculations you want to do and get all the results out at the same time. This is kind of how a quantum computer works. So what do you see here? This actually is a very rudimentary, extremely small quantum computer. So your classical computer operates basically with a memory, a hard drive, and on that hard drive you save information, and that information is saved in bits. And so the more information you want to save, the more bits you require. And so the same in a quantum computer, you want more and more bits. The more complicated the problems you want to solve, the more bits you need. But now you're not using bits, you use quantum bits. And quantum bits are encoded in each ion. So one ion is one quantum bit. And so inside a quantum computer you have then tens, hundreds, thousands, even millions of individual atoms. And each atom is exactly...
The law, it's not sacred. And to challenge it shakes our consciousness. If you can take that radical action in a way that genuinely speaks to everybody else, then you not only have their attention, you have their inspiration, and you build movements that way. Number one, preparation. Calibrate what you are asking for and how you ask for it so that you can win it. Then you've got to choose your strategy. You've got to choose a tactic, a target that can successfully grab public attention. Then you've got to make sure that your execution is flawless. The media will look for every opportunity to delegitimize you. If there is one misstep, one act of violence, it's over.
I've never been in the White House, but the ability to chain myself to the outside of the White House turned out to be important and empowering, and anyone can do it. Most of us don't have huge sums of money. All of us have a body that we can put in the way. I want to say very clearly that civil disobedience is but one tool in the act.
There's
saying at best they could get, in ideal conditions, 50% cleaned up. If there's one thing about this part of the world, it's that ideal conditions are pretty few and far between. The pipeline itself crosses a lot of very important rivers for people's drinking water, for communities, for the salmon stocks, which are so important to this region, all the way as it goes back to northern Alberta, where we already know the impacts that it's having on the Athabasca River, which has become one of the most polluted waterways in the world, and the human health impacts that's having on First Nations communities downstream.
Alberta tar sands, the biggest industrial project in the world, where the size of Earth that they want to move is the size of Texas. Kinder Morgan make $13 million a day. And not only do they make that much, but they're subsidized by our Canadian government. We immobilized the community, 100% consensus by Tsleil-Waututh Nation, where we had a referendum and they said, we could negotiate for millions of dollars with Kinder Morgan. That could help some of our people out of...
It is in a lot of ways a battle between a story of the old and a story of the new. There's a lot of powerful forces trying to make sure that the story of the old continues for as long as it can. We've seen disobedience move from being something that a few people do to a mass movement confronting the fossil fuel industry.
A massive oil rig outfitted for Royal Dutch Shell's remote Arctic exploration parked in Seattle's harbor on Thursday, but not everyone is happy about it.
They have convinced us progress is only made through exploitation of the earth. Everyone is coming to protest. We have scientists, ecologists, and city council members who are willing to get arrested because they understand the severity of this moment. Stand up in whatever manner you can. This is our lunch counter to sit on. This is our history to be made. We hold the world in our hands. Thank you.
Civil disobedience is a powerful tool in social justice work.
To this toolbox, it's not the first one that you should reach for, and if you use it all the time, like any other tool, it's going to get dull. That said, civil disobedience has a role to play. Nobody should have to go to jail about climate change. In a rational system, that would be the last thing that would happen. But because the way power is distributed in our world, sometimes we have to.
One of the central threats to democracy today is the corporate capture of government. We are up against tremendous resources, and those resources are smart. The corporation goes straight to the politician that's going to be on the committee that's going to pass the law that they want to pass and threatens their re-election at exactly the right time. The strategy of global corporations on climate change was partly to recognize that they had a trump card with the United States government. They could stand in the way of global action by blocking American action. There's a level of state failure in the United States. The legislature is bought and paid for by oil companies and other companies. We have to roll back corporate capture of our governments if we want to try and fix these problems that conflict directly with their industry bottom line.
There's nothing radical.
Poverty. Or we could use our own little resources that we have and fight them. 100% consensus, we chose to fight them.
So right here is home. You know, we haven't left. This is where we've been for thousands of years. 85% of our diet came from the waters behind us. We've been measuring the quality of water here for about 20 years. It's getting progressively worse. We're devastated, and what we're trying to do is rehabilitate the damage that has caused. We're going to court soon, Canada, for not consulting us on the Kinder Morgan expansion. One of the ministers said, why don't the First Nations take the money? They need it. We don't need it more than our land. We'll do whatever it takes to make sure this doesn't happen in any way possible.
We are going to launch a massive flotilla of boats from here and surround the terminal on the other side where tankers fill up, as well as have a group of folks on land march to the gates of the marine terminal so that we block it from both the land and the water.